A muslin is a test garment you use to experiment with the fit of a pattern before sewing the final version. When this one required no fit adjustments, I decided to see what else I could change. Using bleach, dye, applique, and a few unexpected detours, here is how an experiment in fit became an experiment in just about everything else. I recently made 2 pairs of the Ponderosa Pants from Ali Olsen Patterns. I really love how both versions turned out, and I've basically been wearing them non-stop. Case in point. This is the muslin I made to test the fit of the pattern before I made my final versions. I have been considering finishing this muslin so that I can add yet another glorious pair to my closet. The only problem is I just don't really love the color of the fabric. So I've been thinking, why don't I try transforming these? How? Here's the plan. I recently made a bunch of chalkboards as props for my videos. It's quite amazing how much time I spent on them, so by golly, I'm going to use them. I also made the box. The plan. The first thing I'm going to do is try to bleach all the color from this fabric. I bought about 6 yards of it from the thrift store, thinking that it would be perfect for muslins. So I don't quite know what the fiber content is, but it just feels like a cotton or some other cellulose fiber. Step 2. I made the other 2 pairs to mimic the colors and textures of a ponderosa pine tree, which is what this pattern is named after. It is also my favorite tree. Continuing with that theme, I'm going to try to dye these with ponderosa pine cones. I have no idea if this will work, but I do know that the ponderosas are going crazy this year, and my front yard is just littered with pine cones. Despite their abundance, there's something that feels rather precious about them to me, like there's some sort of resource I'm supposed to be squirreling away. So this is how I'm going to try to do that squirreling. Step 3 will be to finish the pants, doing things like sewing in the elastic and adding the buttons. I don't want to do all that before I bleach and dye them because I'm not quite sure what the bleach and dye is going to do to things like elastic and buttons, so I'm saving that for the final step. Okay, aren't you so glad that you had this highly useful visual aid? Let's get started. I began by preparing the muslin for bleaching. I basted the unfinished waistband down, as I thought this would make it easier to work with throughout the bleaching and dyeing process. Spoiler alert, I almost immediately ended up pulling this out. We'll get to that. One of the pant legs also needed to be hemmed, so I did that, and ended up also unpicking it later. I promise all these steps made sense when I did them, but anyone who is a maker understands the evolution of a project is never totally predictable. I then filled the bathtub with warm water and added a pint of bleach, which was an amount I completely guessed at. Bleach to water ratios are definitely something I could have looked up, but I was quite enjoying winging it. I then added my muslin, as well as some extra fabric I cut because I thought it might be handy to have some available for future experimentation. I let these things sit and periodically checked their progress. It's working! So I ended up taking out the basting stitching that I put in because I was noticing that it was taking the fabric longer to bleach where the seams are thicker, and so I'm going to leave this in the tub a bit longer and see if I can lighten up these sections. It's also interesting that this red basting thread hasn't lightened up at all, and I don't know if that's because it's polyester or what, but I don't know, experiments. It's interesting. After a couple hours, I drained the bathtub, rinsed the fabric, and hung it outside on the line to dry. Then it was time to move on to the pinecone dye. As I mentioned, the Ponderosa Pines in southwest Colorado are dropping massive amounts of cones this year. It's my understanding that they do this as a survival strategy known as the predator satiation hypothesis. By overwhelming seed-gathering predators like squirrels and birds and pages, they ensure there are enough leftover seeds to sprout successfully. Dropping a bunch of cones can also be a response to environmental stressors like drought and dry hot summers, which has definitely been the case in Colorado these days. So I gathered a bunch of pine cones and filled a stainless steel pot with them. I then filled the pot with water and heated it up on the stovetop. Once it came to a boil, I lowered the temperature and let everything simmer for about an hour or two. Okay, so here's another thing that fascinates me about pine cones. They close up when they get wet. I took a time lapse with my 4-year-old nephew so we could watch the process. Pine cones do this as another survival mechanism. Rain and high humidity cause the scales to swell, which seals the seeds tightly inside and prevents them from either rotting or dropping directly beneath the parent tree. Once conditions dry out, the scales reopen, allowing seeds to be carried far and wide by the wind. I then let the dye sit for a couple of days, trying not to think too hard about how difficult it was going to be to later clean the pot. I strained the dye through some muslin cloth into a 5-gallon bucket. Here are all the closed up pine cones, and here is the dye. Transferred it back into the empty dye pot. Took my pants from the line and added them to the pot. This project is evolving. After I put the pants in the dye bath, I let them sit there for a few days. I didn't really keep track, 3 or 4 maybe. I then took them out, rinsed them, and put them on the line to dry. The color is not super rich or vibrant. I didn't really expect it to be, but it's certainly different. So as a reminder, this is the original fabric. This is what it looked like after bleaching, and this is what it looks like dyed with pine cones from my front yard. But the color is not the only way these changed after my whole dyeing process. They are now quite a bit smaller. Because this fabric has only ever been intended for muslins, I just never pre-washed it and then proceeded to subject it to a bunch of moisture and heat. And so they are now a bit tighter than I typically like my pants and comically short. However, I don't think that they are beyond saving. And here is where we go on a detour. So while these were bathing, I actually made more pinecone dye. 1, because it makes the house smell incredible, and 2, because I wanted to experiment with dyeing some of that extra fabric that I bleached. Specifically, I wanted to dye that fabric and then try adding iron salts, which is supposed to turn the fabric gray. I got this idea from learning about oak gall ink. Oak gall ink was the default writing ink across the globe for centuries. It was used to create historical documents, religious texts, musical manuscripts, correspondences, basically anything that was handwritten. And this ink is made by using oak galls. Oak galls are these round growths that you find on oak trees. They are created when tiny wasps inject their eggs into the oak tree and also release this chemical that manipulates the tree's growth hormone to create this tumor-like structure around the egg. When the larva hatches, the baby wasps then have this safe little structure to live in that is full of nutrient-rich gall tissue. I don't like the way that sounds. To feed on. Once mature, the wasp drills out of the oak gall and leaves this little exit hole. Oak galls are really rich in tannins. When tannins interact with iron salts, this chemical reaction occurs that creates a really dark colored complex. So oak gall ink is made by crushing up the oak galls, soaking and simmering them in water, and then adding iron sulfate to create that dark colored complex. I'm sure a few more other things happen, but that's the basic process. These oak galls all come from the scrub oak that grows around where I live in Colorado. Now, I'm actually not going to crush these up and use them in my dyeing process, but I bring them up because pine cones are also really rich in tannins. I thought that I might be able to make some gray fabric by creating my own iron water and then adding my pinecone dyed fabric to that. So I did this. I let that sit for about a week, strained it into a pot, added some water, and got to experimenting. So here we have the bleached fabric, the pinecone dyed fabric, and the addition of iron water. Now I know there's nothing extraordinary about these colors, but I think that they are quite pretty when juxtaposed. And noticing this is what led me to the new plan. Look, I really need to use these chalkboards. Step 1, I am going to try dyeing the pants yet again by putting them in the iron water solution, because I think I am ever so slightly more likely to wear elephant skin gray over treasure map. So yes, we dye. Step 2, I am going to try lengthening the pants by adding some cuffs to the bottoms of them. And depending on how I feel, I might also add some patch pockets to the back. We'll see. Step 3, I am then going to use some of these lighter fabrics to applique some pretty designs onto the pants. And you've seen this before, the final step is finishing the pants with whatever sewing needs to be done on them. So for step 3, the applique, there are really limitless options for what designs you can embellish your clothes with. I thought that it would be nice to bring in the pinecone theme, but I didn't want it to be super obvious, so I'm thinking I might make some sort of shape like that, maybe? Kind of also looks like a wheat stalk or a fern. So I'm gonna hop on over to Illustrator to experiment with some different placements for this design. I made a pinecone graphic and played around with different placements for it. I ended up with 4 options I liked. Ultimately, I decided to go with option number 2. I saved the iron water from my first experiment, so dyeing the pants was simply a matter of dipping them in the rusty solution. I hope I don't ruin these forever. I might. The chemical reaction happens really quickly, so I only left the pants in the dye pot for a couple of minutes before removing them. I then rinsed them and let them dry on the line before moving on to the next step. I decided to rearrange my steps a bit and finish the pants before doing the applique. The seams were becoming a little ragged after all my experimentation, and I thought it would be a good idea to enclose them before handling the pants even more. I reinserted the elastic at the back waist and stitched that down. I turned and pressed the corners of the waistband and top stitched everything in place. If you decide to make the Ponderosa Pants, Allie has a great sew along on her YouTube channel. You can also use my code PAGEONPURPOSE for 20% off the pattern. Finally, I inserted the snaps into the waistband, which involved using one of my most specific and most favorite sewing tools, a tiny anvil. Then it was time for applique. Applique is a needlework technique in which pieces of fabric are attached to a larger background fabric to create pictures or patterns. The reason I wanted to use it for this project is because organic shapes lend themselves beautifully to fabric layering, and applique has a long history of incorporating botanical motifs. This is something I definitely noticed when I went to an exhibit called An Ecology of Quilts at the American Folk Art Museum in New York City last year. I saw several wonderful examples of applique on show, such as this floral album quilt stitched by Dr. Raymond Bellamy, a Florida sociologist who began quilting in his retirement, several floral applique quilts like this Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden quilt, this example of Hawaiian applique by Mary Alice Kenny Sinton, and this 1850s mourning quilt, composed of inscribed blocks dedicated to the deceased members of a church community. While my pants will not be nearly as intricate as any of these examples, applique seemed to be a fitting technique for stitching pinecones. First, I cut out a bunch of scale shapes in various sizes. I laid these out on the pants just to make sure I liked the arrangement. I then marked the points of the scales with tailor's tacks. Tailor's tacks are hand-sewn, loose thread loops used to transfer pattern markings directly onto fabric. I used these because I was nervous chalk or pen markings might rub off or fade as I handled the fabric. I used white thread for the tops of the scales and dark thread for the bottoms. I then traced the paper scales onto the fabric and cut out the shapes using duckbill scissors, leaving about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I trimmed the sharp points of the scales to reduce fabric bulk, and using a short pin, pinned it into place. I turned under the small 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, finger pressed it down, and began stitching the shape in place. I repeated this process until the scale was finished. As you can see, it is a bit wobbly, so a truly organic shape. I then stitched 6 more off camera. Okay, my first pine cone is appliqued onto the pants. As you know, I was planning on putting another here, that's what all those pieces are for, and then doing the same thing over on this side. But now that I have it laid out, I'm afraid that's just going to be a bit too busy, and so I think I am going to erase this one, and this one, and just do 2, one upside down and one right side up. And so I'm going to take my handy dandy paper pieces and lay them out and see if I can come up with something I like. Okay. I like it. For the second pine cone, I marked its points with a fabric pen as the applique process didn't take me nearly as long as I thought it would, so I didn't think the markings would actually rub off. I then entered the pine cone zone and stitched, stitched, stitched. Because I was stitching onto finished pants, it was rather difficult to sew the shapes to the front leg without accidentally catching a few threads of the back leg. I solved this problem by sliding some tearaway stabilizer into the pant leg to act as a barrier between the 2 layers. That way, if I accidentally caught the stabilizer with my needle, which I did several times, I could gently tear it away. The pine cones have been appliqued. The shapes feel a bit more organic to me, and I actually do want them to say pine cone a bit more than I originally thought. The next steps will be undoing my tailor's tacks up here because I don't need those anymore. And then I am going to unpick these hems and make some cuffs, which I will make out of some of the extra fabric. I don't know if you can see it on camera, but it is ever so slightly lighter than the pants, and I think that will add nicely to this sort of patchwork look. So my plan with these is I'm going to basically sew a cuff, attach it to the end of the pant, and then it can fold up and show on the outside. I did a terrible job explaining that, so let me show you. To make my cuffs, I folded up the fabric to my desired width plus seam allowance. I wanted my finished cuff to be about 3.5 inches, so I folded it up 4 inches. Then I needed to figure out the length to cut the folded fabric. I determined this by measuring the width of the pant leg. I multiplied that measurement by 2 to account for the back of the pant leg, and added a 1/2 inch seam allowance to both sides. So my total measurement was 15 inches. I then cut the cuff out. Next, I unfolded the cuff and pinned the short edges right sides together. I repeated this for the second pant leg and then brought them to the machine. After that, I unpicked the hem on the pants so I had more room to work with. I goofed on recording the remainder of the cuff assembly process, but I will do my best to explain. After stitching that short seam, I pressed it open and then folded the fabric along the crease I had previously pressed, wrong sides together. Something like this. I basted the raw edges together and then was ready to attach the cuff to the pants. I pinned the cuff inside the pants, right side of the cuff to the wrong side of the pant leg, and stitched them together. I pressed this seam toward the cuff, folded the cuff up toward the outside of the pants, and pressed all of this down. And here is what the finished cuffs look like. Also, I ultimately decided against adding pockets, so now I think it's time for the reveal. It's wrap-up time. So what do I think of the Pinecone pants? Well, I took some notes. Don't worry, this is the last chalkboard and it's also going to stay down here. The first thing I want to talk about is the experimental nature of this project. Because these pants were only ever supposed to be a test garment, I feel like that gave me all sorts of creative freedom to just do what I wanted without being too fixated on the end result and making sure that I was doing every last step exactly right. And that was a really empowering and exciting feeling because I talked a little bit about this in my habits and mindset video, but I find that when I am starting something new, I get really stuck in the research phase and feel like I need to learn everything I can possibly know about it before I can just start. I think I especially feel that way if I'm going to make a video about it because I feel like I need to position myself as an expert on a topic, and I am not an expert on like 75% of the things I did in this video. Dyeing with natural resources has been something that I've been interested in for quite some time. I think being on social media and seeing the natural dyeing projects people do is really inspiring and so exciting. It can also be quite intimidating because I'm seeing people who have a ton of experience with this achieve these beautiful colors, and meanwhile I'm gathering things from my front yard and my garage and creating fabrics that are the color of various types of pebbles. And that's okay. I really like the way these neutrals ended up looking together and kind of surprised myself with creating a pair of pants I don't think I ever would have really envisioned myself wearing beforehand, but now that I have them, I'm excited to swan about in my earth tones. This was also my first time doing any sort of applique. I found it both less time-consuming and more enjoyable than I was expecting. I didn't get a ton of footage of my applique process because 1, it's quite repetitive, and 2, I was just in the zone. Pretty therapeutic, to be honest. Are there any things I don't love about this project? Really, my only complaint is the fit of the pants, which is not the fault of the pattern, but the fault of me for not pre-washing my fabric beforehand. I don't think that they are too small, but they are a bit more snug than I prefer to wear my pants, but not so snug that I don't think I'll wear them. Kind of in a very gray area, which is fitting for gray pants, but I guess not fitting because I'm talking about how I don't love the way they fit. Anyway, I think adding the cuffs also really helped. They're not only a fun design detail, but they also give the pants just a bit more length. They're still a cropped look, but they look less like high waters. As a reminder, this pattern is the Ponderosa Pants from Allie Olson Patterns. Allie and I collaborated on a project earlier this year. This video is not sponsored, but I adore this pattern and I've been wearing the ones I've made constantly and have a feeling I will be adding these to the rotation. So if you'd like to make them, you can go get it at her website and use my code PageOnPurpose for 20% off. Okay, I think that's all I have. It is a really rainy day. It is getting quite dark. I can see the camera dimming, and so I'm going to bounce. Why did I say that? Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you are new here and enjoyed this, I hope you consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!